Breaking news. Views on the conflict in Ukraine from the Republican candidates. Joe Biden likes to remind anyone who will listen that the current iteration of the Republican Party is not the one their grandparents belonged to. The situation in Ukraine is one area where this is becoming increasingly apparent. The late Arizona senator and 2008 GOP presidential candidate John McCain was one of President Vladimir Putin's greatest antagonists, as the Arizona Republic pointed out in February 2022, just days after the Russian invasion had begun, because of his long history of warning about the threat posed by Russia. George W. Bush strongly supported the eventual NATO membership of Ukraine and Georgia in his final year as president, 2008. In a viral gaffe last year, he referred to Iraq when he meant to condemn what he saw as a unjustified and brutal war in Ukraine. Former Florida governor and younger brother Jeb Bush traveled abroad in 2015 before announcing his own presidential run. About a year after Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatists in eastern Ukraine, he gave a speech in Berlin in which he said, "Russia must respect the sovereignty of all of its neighbors. And if Russia's aggression is met with silence, who can blame them for acting irrationally?" Mr. Bush was quickly pushed out of the Republican primary in 2016 by reality TV star and real estate mogul Donald Trump, who has come to represent the modern Republican Party. The GOP field is divided over whether or not to continue supporting Ukraine's war effort, with some candidates joining Mr. Trump in his isolationist stance. All of the frontrunners oppose further intervention, while Republicans who adhere to more traditional foreign policy positions remain in the back of the pack. Here is what the qualifying candidates for the first Republican primary debate, in which Mr. Trump may or may not participate, have said about Ukraine. While in office, Trump threatened to cut off military aid to Ukraine in the hopes that Volodymyr Zelensky, the country's then rookie president and current wartime leader, would launch an investigation into Trump rivals Hunter and Joe Biden. When asked whether he agreed with the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community that Russia had interfered in the 2016 U.S. election, President Trump sided with Russian President Vladimir Putin during an embarrassing press conference in Helsinki, Finland. Recently, Mr. Trump has called for a halt to all aid to Ukraine until federal agencies provide evidence of what he has called corrupt business dealings on the part of Mr. Biden and his son. Mr. Trump claimed that Vice President Biden was dragging the United States into the war during a rally in Pennsylvania in July. In reference to what Republicans have claimed are allegations of bribery against Mr. Biden, Mr. Trump said, "The U.S. Congress should refuse to authorize a single additional payment of our depleted stockpiles until the FBI, Department of Justice, and Internal Revenue Service hand over every scrap of evidence they have on the Biden crime family's corrupt business dealings." The Republican Party has failed to produce any proof of the alleged plot. In March, Trump made an appearance on Fox News and claimed that he and Putin could end the conflict in Ukraine within a day. "And there's a simple compromise that can be reached. But if I tell you, I won't be able to use that bargaining chip in the future. However, compromise is simple to achieve. In just one day, I'll have everything settled and the peace restored. A year and a half has passed. Quite some time, indeed." He continued, "I just don't see how anything could go wrong. Ukraine is being destroyed at an alarming rate, so it is crucial that the fighting cease immediately." When it comes to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, Mr. Trump has shown mixed feelings. Article 5 of the Defense Pact states that an attack on any one of the 31 members constitutes an attack on all of them, but while he was president, he was ambivalent about whether or not he would support this provision. The United States only used this article once, after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. He reportedly wanted to withdraw the United States from NATO. DeSantis, Ron. After calling the conflict a territorial dispute in March, Mr. DeSantis was forced to backtrack. Mr. DeSantis made the remark in an email to Tucker Carlson, who was then the host of Fox News. U.S. involvement in the territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them, he wrote at the time. While the U.S. has many vital national interests, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. He retracted his statement during an appearance on Fox Nation. What I mean is that Russia has long had a hand in the current hotspots of conflict in eastern Ukraine, specifically the Donbass and Crimea. In any case, they had, he said, though I doubt legitimately. Lots of native Russians live there. That's some tough fighting, and that's what I meant. It wasn't that I thought Russia was entitled to that. If I needed to clarify that, I could have. A ceasefire, he said in April, is in everybody's interest. You don't want to have mass casualties, mass expense, and end up with a stalemate, he warned in an interview with the Japanese English-language weekly Nikkei Asia. An interview with Vivek Ramaswamy. The tech entrepreneur made the claim on August 5 that Hunter Biden is the reason the United States is helping Ukraine. The United States Armed Forces exist to promote American interests and to defend the country. Mr. Ramaswamy told a sparse crowd at a campaign event in Council Bluffs, Iowa, "We don't need to go off and fight some random war that's arguably a repayment for a private bribe that a family member of the United States received, $5 million from Burisma," as reported by NBC News. Was Hunter Biden's bribe corrupt? Without a doubt, it was. Do I think it has anything to do with how we're treating Ukraine? Perhaps in response to unsubstantiated claims made by Republican lawmakers, he added, "I think it's likely that it does." During Mr. Biden's tenure as vice president, House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer claims he received information relating to the exchange of money for policy decisions regarding a $5 million payment made to Mr. Biden and a family member. According to the New York Times, Mr. Ramaswamy has stated that he will work to secure an agreement that offers major concessions to Mr. Putin, including the removal of sanctions, the closure of all U.S. bases in Eastern Europe, and the prevention of Ukraine's entry into NATO. Then, he'd demand that Russia sever its military ties with China and re-enter the START nuclear pact. A top military threat, he told ABC News, is the Sino-Russian alliance. I don't think it is preferable for Russia to be able to invade a sovereign country that is its neighbor, he said. By continuing the conflict in Russia and arming the Ukrainian government even more, I believe we are playing right into China's hands. In June, the former vice president became the first Republican presidential candidate to visit Ukraine to meet with Mr. Zelensky. Mr. Pence said this to NBC News at the time, "I believe America's the leader of the free world. But coming here as a private citizen has strengthened my resolve to do my part, to keep calling for strong American support for our Ukrainian friends and allies. I have seen the bravery of Ukrainian soldiers holding the line in the woods, the bravery of the people here in Irpin that held back the Russian army, and the bravery of families whose homes were literally shelled in the midst of an unconscionable and unprovoked Russian invasion. The trip," he said, "steel, Ed. My resolve, and it has made me better equipped to be able to go home as I speak to the American people about the vital importance of American support to repel Russian aggression." The slowness of the Biden administration in sending aid to Ukraine was another point of his criticism. Saying, "We should never send American troops into Ukraine, and we don't need to," he ruled out the possibility. "Too many people in our party are sounding the retreat, saying they're fine with Putin keeping the land grab he made in eastern Ukraine and even offering him promises in exchange. I heard my former running mate announced over the weekend that he's willing to promise that Ukraine will never be in NATO," Mr. Pence said to radio host Hugh Hewitt last month. Providing the brave fighters in Ukraine with the means to repel the Russian invasion is the quickest route to security and the best way to delay the day when U.S. forces are once again called into battle in Europe, in my opinion. And strength is the only language Putin speaks. Scott, Tim. However, when asked whether or not it was appropriate for the Biden administration to send cluster munitions, the South Carolina senator sidestepped the question. Following in the footsteps of Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Scott told NBC News that Vice President Biden has done a terrible job explaining and articulating to the American people what U.S. interests are in Ukraine. First, it prevents or reduces attacks on the homeland, Mr. Scott said in May, as reported by the Greenville Post and Courier. Second, the article continues, as part of NATO and land being contiguous to Ukraine, it will reduce the likelihood that Russia will have the weaponry or the will to attack on NATO territory, which would get us involved. As early as March 2022, less than a month after the invasion, Mr. Scott declared that the conflict was being fought